Welcome friends. Today we are going to talk about the anatomy of spinal cord. So first of all, looking towards the general anatomical part. So what is spinal cord? Spinal cord is the part of central nervous system which is actually enclosed in the vertebral column. So it is a cylindrical structure that is continuous from the caudal brain stem and extends through the vertebral column until its termination, that is called as conus medullaris at the level of L1 and L2. There are two major enlargements, one at the level of cervical and other at the level of lumbosacral spinal segments. This region contains nerve cells that contribute to the plexuses in that particular area, innervating the upper and lower limbs. I think everybody can recall the brachial plexus and lumbar plexus. So these particular things are coming from these particular enlargements only. So you can see the label, this is cervical enlargement, then lumbosacral enlargement, then this will be the end, it is conus medullaris. But some threads-like things are coming down towards the later part of the vertebral column, called as corta equina, and the middle line will be called as phylum terminal, which we are going to see in the later stages. So then we will talk about the coverings. So covering, the same coverings which the central nervous system, that is brain, was having will be continued here also. So to appreciate the meningeal covering, the spaces of spinal cord, you have to look the cross section of cervical level. So you can see the spaces. First of all, there are two spaces, epidural and subarachnoid space. So this particular part is epidural space, the real space between the dura and vertebrae. In brain, this is the potential space. Normally, it is filled with the fat and venous plexuses. Then there is subarachnoid space. It lies between the arachnoid and pia mater. It is filled with the CSF. Spinal blood vessels are suspended in this particular space. Again, just see it again. So epidural, that is between dura and vertebrae. Subarachnoid, that is between arachnoid and pia mater. So these are the two spaces. Then about the meninges, the same three PAD, that is pia mater, arachnoid, and dura mater. So you can see the dura mater first of all. It is outermost layer, tough, thick, and protective in nature. Then arachnoid, it is middle layer, thinner, more delicate than dura mater. It is ballooned up against the dura. Pia mater, it is the innermost, delicate layer that attaches tightly to the surface of spinal cord. So when you come from in to out, then it will be PAD, that is pia mater, arachnoid, and dura mater. Next, talk about some outgrowths, that is plial outgrowths. Special plial outgrowths function to anchor the spinal cord and gives this stability within the dural sac. So there are denticulate ligaments, that is thickening of pia and glial elements that form the ribbons along the lateral surface of spinal cord and separate the posterior and spinal anterior roots. You see this blue color thing, this one. This is denticulate ligament. Then there is phylum terminal at the end part. In the purple, you can see it is the extension of pia actually, that is pia mater, and supporting cells attaches the caudal end of the spinal cord to the coccyx. So plial growth basically kya hai? It is for fixing. So denticulate ligament fixes in the lateral sides, both the lateral sides, and phylum terminal fixes in the straight line till the level of caudal end of spinal cord to the coccyx. So plial outgrowth is nothing, it is just an एंकरिंग स्ट्रक्चर ऑफ द स्पाइनल कॉर्ड, एक लाइन में सीधा रखने के लिए एक जगह पे these are outgrowth which help in anchor, that is support. Next we can see a cross structure. So the spinal cord composed of white matter containing ascending and descending myelinated fiber tracts surrounding the butterfly or H-shaped gray matter. So gray matter is inside, white matter is outside. Gray matter contains the nerve cell bodies. Further, the gray matter can be divided into two parts, posterior horn and anterior horn. The central canal is hollow tube that is continuous with the ventricular system and runs longitudinally through the entire length of spinal cord. Now you can see the labeling. This is central canal, the posterior horn, anterior horn. The middle H shape or butterfly shape is gray matter and the outer one is white matter. So this structure you should remember. It is the cross-sectional structure of the spinal cord at a particular level. Next, one more structure we can see. The external surface of spinal cord is marked by some features and sulci. These structures serve as the key landmarks for the spinal cord structures. So you can see the posterolateral sulcus. This one is posterolateral sulcus, entry point for posterior root carrying the sensory information. Then you can see the anterior sulcus on the anterior side. These are the exit point for the anterior root carrying the motor information. So posterior part basically carries the sensory information. Anterolateral part basically carries the motor information towards the other parts of the body. You can see the posterior median fissure and anterior median fissure is also present at the level adjacent to the central canal. Now, talking to especially of the gray matter, the gray matter comprises of posterior horn, which contain substantia gelatinosa and Lisser's tract. Anterior horn contains the motor neurons, general organization, core medially and limb laterally. Lateral horn, little bit, only in the thoracic or sympathetic neuron, sacral parasympathetic spinal cord. So you can see this is the posterior horn, contains the substantia gelatinosa and the Lisser's tract. This is the anterior horn, basically contains the motor part or motor neurons. Lateral part on the lateral side, especially in the two places only, in the thoracic and sacral. So in thoracic for sympathetic neuron and sacral for parasympathetic neurons. Now talking the white part. The white part, there are many structures which you have to see. White comprise of following ascending tract and descending tract. The ascending tract is spinothalamic tract and spinocerebellar tract. Posterior column, medial lemniscus pathway, that is fasciculus gracialis and fasciculus cuneatus. Descending, that is lateral and anterior corticospinal tract. Again, ascending में क्या है? Spinothalamic tract and spinocerebellar tract. Posterior column, medial lemniscus pathway, which normally called as fasciculus gracialis and fasciculus cuneatus. Via this descending tract, they are lateral and anterior corticospinal tract. So you can see fasciculus gracialis, this is for sensory, fine touch, proprioceptor from the ipsilateral lower limb. Then fasciculus cuneatus, sensory, again, fine touch, proprioceptor from ipsilateral upper limb. The gracialis is for lower limb, same function. Cuneatus will be for the upper limb, same function. Then you can see spinocerebellar tract. It is proprioceptor from the limbs to cerebellum. Lateral corticospinal tract, motor to ipsilateral ventral horn, mostly limb musculature को control करेगा. Spinothalamic tract, that is pain and temperature from contralateral side, this opposite side of the body. Then there is anterior corticospinal tract, motor to ipsi and contralateral ventral horn, mostly for the axial skeleton. So this was about the white matter. As we know that at spinal cord is a long structure, so there are different levels. So some specific structures are present at different levels. So the general structure of spinal cord is consistent throughout its length. Nevertheless, there are regional differences. So at the different type of vertebrae like cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral, there will be different type of vertebrae. So if you see at the cervical level, you can get this type of structure. Then thoracic level, then lumbar level, and then sacral region. So you can see when we are coming up to down, the white matter is decreasing and gray matter is increasing simultaneously. And the little bit shape of the gray matter and white matter is also similar. It was butterfly basically, then it became little bit H-like, then again butterfly, healthy one. Then sacral, you can see the white matter is very less and the gray matter is increasing size in the size. One more view we can see that there is cervical region and lumbar region, there is have more gray matter. So why? Because this particular region have to innervate the limbs, upper limb and lower limb. So there are basically plexuses are going to be formed at that particular level. That's why they are having more gray matter. Then the amount of white matter, you can see that the amount of white matter increases as you move from caudal to rostral segment of spinal cord. The cervical region has most of the white matter because it carries information to and from all the levels of spinal cord to the next further level. So you should understand there are some differences in the different cross-sectional regions in white matter and gray matter, and the reason is also given in this particular slide. Next, talking about the blood supply, the spinal cord receives the blood supply from two systems, that is vertebral-basilar system. Here, the vertebral arteries, branches of the basilar arteries in the brain stem, And in the spinal cord, they branch to form the anterior and posterior spinal artery. Remember the name anterior and posterior spinal artery. Then there are segmental arteries which are branching from the posterior intercostal arteries and supply the anterior and posterior root as well as the posterior and anterior spinal arteries. So vertebral artery, you might be remembering, it will be the branch from the subclavian which is going upside, and you can easily identify this in the cervical vertebral region because in the transversus there is one foramen. Through that foramen, this artery is going upside, and then it forms the basilar artery at that level. And it can continue in the further part also in the brain part with the type known as circle of Willis, if you remember. Now talking one by one, that is vertebral basilar artery, you can see it here. The branches from vertebral artery joins to form the anterior spinal artery on the anterior surface. Branches from vertebral artery on the posterior inferior cerebral artery forms to form the paired posterior spinal artery. You can see it here. This is subclavian artery, the branch vertebral artery, then anterior spinal artery, and branch to the posterior spinal artery. This is the supply from the vertebral basilar system of blood region or arteries. Then for the segmental arteries, posterior branches of intercostal arteries give rise to the segmental spinal arteries. In turn, these branches to form radicular arteries. You can see the radicular artery that supply the anterior and posterior root of the each of them. At the various level of vertebral levels, segmental arteries also gives off segmental medullary arteries, which can supply either of them, that is either anterior spinal artery or posterior spinal artery. You can see posterior branch of intercostal artery, segmental medullary artery. You can see here anterior spinal artery, which is going in the middle of the things. So this was about the segmental arteries. We have to get one more view from here, segmental arteries. The segmental spinal artery branch to form the posterior anterior radicular artery. The radicular artery supply the anterior and posterior spinal root at each level. Segmental medullary artery also branch of segmental spinal arteries. However, they supply either of the anterior spinal artery or posterior spinal artery. You can see this is segmental spinal artery, then anterior radicular arteries are formed, posterior radicular artery is there, then segmental medullary artery which goes to the anterior spinal artery. Then from posterior side can go to the posterior spinal artery. You can see from the particular two twigs which you can see from this diagram. So this was about the segmental arteries. Then we'll talk about the spinal arteries. So the anterior spinal arteries supplies the anterior two-thirds of the spinal cord. This includes the base of posterior horn also. The posterior spinal arteries only supplies the posterior one-third of the spinal cord. So what we can see, the anterior and posterior spinal arteries are supplied by the vertebral basilar system superiorly and by the spinal segmental along the length of the spinal cord. So here you can see anterior spinal artery, posterior spinal. The anterior spinal artery is given to the more supply. Next, we will talk about the roots. So spinal nerves are formed with a combination of fibers from the posterior and anterior roots. So let's see the posterior root. You can see here, this is posterior root, which is sensory in nature, traveling to spinal cord. You move to spinal cord. You can see the parts also. This is spinal root, spinal ganglion, and spinal nerve, which is always mixed type. Then you can see the anterior root, which is motor. The fibers travel away from the spinal cord, and ultimately both are going to be mixed together, and they are going to be called as a spinal nerve. Furthermore, you can see in the dissected part, so this is cross-section of vertebral column at cervical level. In this image, you can clearly see the posterior and anterior roots. You can see simply here, this is spinal nerve, which is going to come out from this particular foramen. This is posterior root, which will be sensory. This is anterior root, which will be motor. In cross-section also, you can simply see the both the roots. Now, talking about the general anatomy. So there are approximately 31 spinal pairs. Everybody knows, I think. The skull, its brain, 12 cranial nerves, 1 to 12, 7 cervical, but 8 cervical nerves, C1 to C8. 12 thoracic vertebrae, the 12 thoracic nerve, 5 lumbar vertebrae, the 5 lumbar nerve, 5 sacral, the 5 sacral nerve, 1 to 4 coccygeal vertebrae, which are fused actually. So only one coccygeal nerve will be there. So this is how you can identify all 31 pairs. Talking about visceral nervous system, they are not present at all the level, but basically they are associated with the T1 to L2 and S2 to S4. The sympathetic nervous system, you can see here the part sympathetic, which is showing the pink. The visceral motor neurons of the sympathetic nervous systems are located within the T1 to L2 segments of spinal cord. In the cross section, you can simply identify the lateral. We have earlier talked that in certain parts of the spinal cord only we are going to get the lateral horns. It was in thoracic region for the sympathetic nervous system. If you go back and see the slides, then you can see the parasympathetic part. It is only in the S2 to S4 region. It is visceral motor segment. Here also you can simply identify the lateral horns where visceral efferent cell bodies are going to be present. So this is all about the general of the spinal cord. In the summary, you can see the spinal cord contains white matter tracts carrying the information to and from the higher centers in the brain and the periphery. Additionally, spinal cord has an intrinsic function such as coordinating the reflex. Remember, reflex कहाँ से govern होगा? Only from spinal cord. Spinal nerves composed of afferent and efferent nerve fibers branches of the spinal cord to innervate rest of the body. Spinal cord is also surrounded by the meningeal covering that protects and secures the spinal cord within the vertebral column. Spinal cord receives the blood supply from two parts, that is vertebral-basilar system and multiple segmental arteries along with the length of whole of the vertebral column. So this particular knowledge will be critical to understand the basic of the organization, location of specific fiber tracts, so we can make some neurological diagnosis. After this lecture will be uploaded basically for the tracts. So that's all for today. Thank you.